Hello, welcome to my channel Moretta Threads. I am Moretta, but you can call me Moretta, Marta Threads, or Threadsy. If you're one of my subscribers, first of all, thank you. Second of all, this is the discount code for this sewing pattern. The sewing pattern is linked below and it'll last the first 48 hours. So in today's tutorial, we are making this top. So this top I initially made in a bamboo fabric to match the skirt that I also have as a sewing pattern. I wore this for my birthday and I always get inquiries as to whether or not this sewing pattern that I've paired with the skirt is available, so now it is. So this sewing pattern is going to have two different types of resources, and the one you use will be dictated by how advanced of a sewer you are. If you are an advanced beginner or intermediate, you're probably going to use the written and visual instructions. They use two sewing machines, a sewing machine and an overlocker serger, and it is also timestamped to coincide with this video if there is anything you need clearing up. And then over here we have my beginner camp. So if you're a beginner, I'm going to assume that you only have access to one sewing machine. And so I'm just going to use one sewing machine and we're going to do everything step by step, slowly together. So with that being said, I think we're ready to get into it. To begin, print page 1 and use the measuring box to measure 1 centimeter or 1 inch. From there, I like to stack all my pages together and then lay it down and trim away the right-hand border and then the bottom border. You will notice that we obviously did not trim away the left and top border. That is because if you have cut away too much of your sewing pattern, when you overlay 1 on top of 2 so that the arrows touch to create a little X, there is a small little tolerance there that acts as a buffer if you have removed too much. So just get those little arrows to connect to create an X and do a little tab of sticky tape one at a time. And once you have done all of those little tabs, then you can go in with your longer lengths. So that way you know you're happy with your pattern and you can lock it into place. So before we start cutting out our sewing pattern, I'll highlight this notch. This notch in this sewing pattern goes outwards, whereas they usually go inwards. This is an example of the notch having been cut inwards, and you can see here when I turn it inside out, we've cut too far into our seam allowance. So to avoid that, the notches on these patterns are going outwards. And for those of you who don't know, a notch is essentially just a marker point. So when we're assembling our pattern later, you'll know which way is top and bottom. So there are 4 segments of this sewing pattern and each of them will be cut out on the fold. So just make sure you place your fabric on the fold and include that little notch. So now it is time to do the darts. So this is how I like to do it. I map out where my darts need to be, and in that sewing pattern, I add in 3 markers. I flip over the fabric, I find where I put those pins, and I add in 3 new pins, and I will now remove that from the paper pattern. Because we removed the paper pattern, those front pins came out, so then you have to add in pins again, and then you can pull your pattern apart, and now we have a little map on each side. So before we begin, just make sure that the bad side of the fabric is currently facing us. I'm going to show you this little tape method. This is preferable when you're working with lace if you can't lay out your lines properly, but as you can see, it's just a really easy, simple way to map out your lines. However, a more sustainable approach and usually my preferred method of mapping out my darts is to get a ruler and use those connecting points and just line it up with my chalk pen. Now, a lot of our pattern pieces are quite similar, so I just want to make sure I'm keeping track of which one is my outer or inner layer. So this one here was my outer layer of fabric, and I just popped some pins in the bottom to identify that. So now it is time to close up our darts. What I like to do with my darts is get really long tails of thread to begin. And the reason for that is at the start of this dart, I cannot back tack, and that's because of the kind of fabric that I'm using. It would just kind of jam in my feed dogs of my sewing machine if I did that. So I just do it as normal, pull it out, and then with those really long tails, I just like to tie a knot, and so I pull them through 2 times, and you're just going to repeat that for the remaining 3 darts. With that done, I'm going to move on to my front outer layer of fabric, and I know it's my outer layer because I have those pins crossed in the front. So I grab my back panel, it says outer, so I know it's the right one. I get those notches to link up and I pin the sides together. Then you're going to repeat that process again now for our lining layers of fabric. However, this one is going to look slightly different because we need to keep an opening on one of the sides so that we can turn this inside out later. So I am just adding a chalk marker to the pattern, and I'm doing it just below where the dart is so that I can turn this inside out. And as you can see there, it measures at about 8 centimeters opening. Now, before we close those side seams, we need to practice our side seams. So most of this sewing pattern is generally done with an overlocker. However, we don't have an overlocker. And if we were to close up that side seam with a zigzag stitch, this is what we would be left with. It would stretch it out and be a little warped. So we want to make sure that we're sewing at the 1 centimeter point, and the 1 centimeter point should mean a little bit of fabric is just poking out to the right of that sewing foot. So if you do it like that, this is what you will be left with. You can tell that that right one has no warping as opposed to that left one. So maybe have a go first of just practicing that a little bit on some scrap pieces of fabric, and then if you're happy, we can close up the side seams of our actual top. Now I am going to start on my lining layers of fabric, and I want you to pay attention right there. I just sewed over that dart that we created, and the dart is facing down. Because this is my lining fabric, that means that when I go to do my outer layer of fabric, I'm going to ensure that the dart is facing up, and that'll just minimize any bulking that we'll have in the side seams of the top. So while we're closing up this seam, also make sure that we're keeping an eye out for our chalk markers so that we can leave that little opening open. So because we're using stretch fabrics, because it is quite a fitted top, you want the stitch work to also allow stretch in it. And that's why we do a zigzag stitch. As you see there, it has give. The other option obviously is a serged or overlocked edge, and because it's a chain stitch, it's all kind of linked together, so you can pull it and it has that give. Whereas this is why we're not doing a straight stitch, because if you pull, it'll crack. So with all of our side seams now closed, I want you to grab your lining layer of fabric, turn it good side facing up, because we're now going to pin the silicone edged elastic along the top perimeter of the top. So while we're working with the silicone edge, you'll notice that it's a silicone edge and we won't be able to sew on top of it because it is so grippy. So I have just gotten some Scotch tape, or you can use normal tape, or you can just get some baking paper from the pantry or whatever and place it on top. And I'm just putting it right on that sticky edge and concealing it so that I can get my foot to glide over it nicely. The stitch that I'm doing for this is still a zigzag stitch because I obviously need it to maintain stretch. And as I sew down, I'm just removing that tape and moving it downwards each time so that I can still get that movement with the foot. So just do this nice and slow and make sure that there is no tension on the elastic. We're just applying it nice and flat. This is what it'll look like when it's done, and as you can see there, when we pull, that zigzag has give and stretch. So now pick up your outer layer of fabric, get that front up, and we're going to connect those little side seams together. So see how I have one side seam going to the left and then the other side seam going to the right? That's just because we want to minimize bulking later when the top is assembled. So just repeat that process, and when you do it, make sure you're putting a pin right in that center point because we want those stitches to connect. So with that secured, we can then just properly put in the inside of that top, lay it down flat, and this is what we're working with. So now I'm just going to add a few more pins into the top perimeter. Now, because of that silicone edge, I want to make sure that I don't sew over the top of it. So I'm going to play around with my sewing machine functions here, and I want to have a zigzag stitch still, but I just want it to be as narrow as possible. So we're going for just a slight stagger. So I just practiced that on that little scrap piece of fabric, and now that I'm happy, So while you go over those side seams, just make sure that you've definitely got them facing alternate ways. When you finish that, open up the top and have a look around that entire perimeter to make sure you're happy with where you've placed the fabric in conjunction to that silicone. So this is probably the hardest part of a sewing pattern like this because seamless is just a little bit confusing sometimes. So we're going to do this twice. I have taken about 2 to 3 centimeters on this side seam and pinned it together. And then as you can see, we haven't touched that other side at all. So we're just going to do this one more time, nice and slow. So I'll take that pin out. So I'm going to grab that top layer and fold it 2 to 3 centimeters. Same here, 2 to 3 centimeters, pinch them together and just stabilize that with a pin. We'll actually remove that pin in a moment, but it just helps us keep track of what we're keeping together. So I put my hand in there and those layers that I put together of the 2 to 3 centimeters, I've pinched it. And now that I have found those 2 layers, I'm going to remove that pin and put the pin back in, but on this side now, on the bad side of the fabric. People liken sewing seamless stuff as like a burrito because everything's kind of just wrapped inside of it. So I am going to try and find a starting point. So I'm just going to pull maybe 8 centimeters out from that seam, get a pin and pop those pieces of fabric together. So we're just going to concentrate on really the very first pin that we put in. So find that first pin, place it underneath the sewing foot and make sure when we do this, remember our seam allowance, we have it facing alternate ways. So I've got that top layer facing me, so I've got the under layer facing away from me. And you're just going to start stitching on our normal zigzag stitch that we have set for ourselves. You may need to put the needle down at some point and readjust the direction of the fabric as I've just done. And I am just sewing all the way down till I get to this corner. So from that corner, I am then going to want to go to the next corner. So I'm just going to put in 1 pin there and then just 1 maybe in the middle so that I'm making sure I'm not stretching my fabric as I sew. And then just repeat again. You're going to go from that corner to the side seam. However, as we get to the side seam, we've actually run out of fabric to sew on, and that's because it's all wrapped up inside like a burrito in the top. So as I sew, I'm just going to pull. I run out of fabric, so I go inside of it and I pull it and I keep on going. And with that done, you've pretty much finished making the top. So as you can see here, we have our top and it's all just inside there, and you'll just keep pulling it and it'll keep coming out. It kind of reminds me of one of these toys that we had and that would just like slip out of your hands because it was concealed in itself. Anyway, find that little hole that we made, pull the top inside out and then find that hole again and grab some pins and put some pins in it really close to the edge. You're then just going to come across to your sewing machine and as close to the edge as possible, we're just going to close it off and back tack if you can. If you actually have a look at other clothes that you already own that are seamless, keep an eye out for it and you'll actually notice something very similar to this. It's this concealed little seam edge, and that's pretty much where they turned everything inside out to create a seamless garment. So because we did a zigzag stitch, we went through a little bit more fabric than we otherwise would if we were using an overlocker or a serger. And the only difference I think that you can really notice between the two machines is the bottom of those side seams, what I'm playing with around here. You can see that it's not sitting 100% right. However, it eventually will get set into place once you wear it. So I'll show you another top that I made, and this one I made with an overlocker or serger, depending on where you're based and what you call it. You can see here it's much cleaner. However, all in all, you're not really going to notice. It's a very small difference. That is the end of the tutorial. I hope that was helpful. If you have any questions at all, please comment below and I will get back to you. But outside of that, good luck and enjoy your sewing.